Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Good evening and a warm welcome to this, our 14th annual Leon Levy Lecture on Biography. My name is Kai Bird, and I'm the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and founded by Shelby White, who's with us tonight, and the Leon Levy Foundation. She founded it in the year 2007, and I'm very gratified that she's here, together with the president of the Graduate Center, Robin Garrell. I also want to thank Thad Zilkowski, our hardworking associate director, for all his wisdom these past few years. And thanks also to Wendy DeMarco Fuentes, Karen Sander, Tara McDonald, Molly Yin, Jimmy Koch, and all the other folks at CUNY for helping to organize this dinner. We are meeting tonight before a small live audience. This is our very first live event since the pandemic hit. But we are also joined by hundreds of other lovers of biography who will be watching this event via live streaming. Welcome everyone, whether you're here virtually or not. Unlike all our other Leon Levy events, this evening is a formal lecture, so there will be no Q&A at the end. Each year, we select an eminent biographer to give the annual Leon Levy lecture to talk about a theme related to the art and craft of biography. I've always believed that biography is not only the best vehicle for conveying an understanding of history and the human condition, but it also happens to be the most difficult and sometimes obsessive of scholarly pursuits. To quote George Orwell, writing a book is a horrible, exhausting struggle, like a long bout of some painful illness. One would never undertake such a thing if one were not driven on by some demon whom one can neither resist nor understand. Well, that is the working biographer, day after day, year after year. We have with us tonight many working biographers, including some current and former recipients of a Leon Levy Biography Fellowship, all generously funded by Shelby and the Leon Levy Foundation. More than 50 such fellowships have been awarded since 2007, and some 25 hefty biographies have been published to date. In recent years, thanks to Doran Weber of the Sloan Foundation, who is with us tonight, we have been able to fund an annual fellowship devoted to biographies of scientists. We also have with us tonight one of the co-chairs of our endowment committee, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer Stacy Schiff. The other co-chair, Robert Caro, cannot be here tonight because he is off in Paris, taking a break from LBJ. Stacy actually gave the very first Leon Levy lecture in the year 2008. We also have with us tonight David Nassau, Judith Thurman, Brenda Wineapple, and David Levering Lewis, all of whom have given this same lecture in recent years. We're also missing Nancy Milford, the first director of the Leon Levy Center, who recently passed. And we miss her. She was an inspiration for her biography of Zelda. Last but not least, I spy one Joseph Cannon, perhaps America's greatest living author of historical espionage thrillers, sitting over there. He's sort of a biographer, but one who writes without footnotes, you know? So we can't count him as one of the brethren. Sorry, Joe. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce the 14th Annual Leon Levy Lecturer, Annette Gordon-Reed. Professor Gordon-Reed is the author or editor of 7 books, including Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, Andrew Johnson, the 17th President, Race on Trial, Law and Justice in American History, Most blessed of the patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of the Imagination, and The Hemmingses of Monticello, An American Family, a stunning book that won both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. Her most recent book, On Juneteenth, is a riveting blend of memoir and history. Gordon Reed, who is the Carl M. Loeb University Professor at Harvard University, has received numerous honors, including a MacArthur Fellowship and a National Humanities Medal. I want to point out that Annette mentions in her memoir that when she first entered first grade in Conroe, Texas, her parents insisted on sending her to Hulan N. Anderson Elementary, where she was the only African American in a classroom of some 25 white students. Annette writes, quote, "I was a good student right off the bat. In those days, when people cared less about making children feel bad, I was a bluebird, the group for best readers. I don't know, Annette, but I suspect you are something more than a bluebird now. More like an American eagle whose startling biographies are compelling us to see our country's history anew." Professor Gordon Reed, welcome to our little den of biographers. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's great to be here tonight. I love this room. I've been here before, and it's just the right size, I think, for a conversation and a discussion and a speech, as a matter of fact. I think biography has been crucial to my life as a writer. I always wanted to be a writer, but I think biography gave me a sense of what it is that I wanted to write. I tell the story about discovering Thomas Jefferson in the third grade through a third grade level biography of Jefferson. They had them in the back of the room, and there were biographies of Dolly Madison, James Madison, Jefferson, George Washington Carver, and for whatever reason, the Jefferson biography stuck with me. That was the one that made the greatest impression, and I think it had to do with the fact that he loved to read, and I loved to read. He was interested in science and interested in the world and trying to discover things, and I saw myself as a person like that. But the biography was written with a story told by a fictional enslaved boy who was supposed to be Jefferson's friend. And I noticed that there was a difference in the portrayal of the enslaved boy. He's Jefferson's friend, and he's always exasperated at Jefferson because Jefferson is, he always has his nose in a book. He's always doing those kinds of things. He doesn't want to go hunting and fishing anymore. And so the enslaved boy was portrayed as we would say in the South, trifling, unserious, and Jefferson was everything that was supposed to be good and wonderful in the world. And I, even then, felt discomfort because I understood that I was supposed to identify with the enslaved boy, and I actually identified with the person who wanted to learn to read and wanted to learn things, not him as a slave owner, but those aspects of his personality I found interesting. And so that got me thinking about life writing, and I continued to read biographies of Jefferson, books about Jefferson that were age appropriate from then on. And I had no inkling that I was going to end up being a Jefferson scholar. But that's where it started for me, and that's one of the reasons that I hope that schools, or wish that schools would go back to using biography as a way of introducing students to history, because it led to thinking about history. Good biography doesn't just talk about the person, it talks about the times in which the person lived, and so you should feel that you know more about those times after you have read a good biography. My first serious look at Jefferson as a subject came when I read Winthrop Jordan's book, White Over Black, which is not a biography of Jefferson, but it's all about the history of race relations in the United States and the English attitude and the British attitude and the American attitude about race. But there's a chapter called Thomas Jefferson, Self and Society, and it's a mini biography. It talks about Jefferson's life. It describes him, where he was born, how he grew up, and his attitudes about slavery and his attitudes about a family, the Hemings family, that I had not read about before because the age-appropriate books that I used didn't really talk about that. Strangely enough, now they do. They talk about Sally Hemings, and I'll talk about that later on, but that was not a part of what I knew about Jefferson's story. And I found that intriguing. A couple of years later, Fawn Brody's biography of Jefferson came out. A couple of years, not after Winthrop Jordan's book, but after I read Winthrop Jordan's book. And I wanted that book so badly that I joined the Book of the Month Club to purchase it, 4 books for $1, not knowing that that meant that there were going to be books showing up at my home of the month. And my parents were like, where does this come from? And then they figured out what happened, and they wrote to them, and they stopped sending books. But I did have my biography of Jefferson, and that's probably the first kind of serious, long-form biography that I read. Something else was happening to me at that time. I discovered novels, being interested in novels. And I read Hemingway, and I read, didn't read Faulkner at that time, that's much later. But Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Sinclair Lewis for some reason, who isn't a person that we think about very much these days. He won the Nobel Prize, and he's virtually unknown now, which is not a great story for writers to think about. But I became interested in him, and so I would read his books, and I would also read biographies of them. For every author that I got interested in, I would read the biography to try to figure out what made this person write this, how did this person do it? Because I knew I wanted to be a writer, and I think reading biographies was a way for me to figure out how did they do it? How did this happen? And of course, as you know, there are all different kinds of paths to what they were doing. There's no one formula, but I was searching for that, probably unconsciously, that's what interested me in this. And not just those kinds of writers. James Baldwin, I became very interested in him, and there was not a biography of him at that time, but I read articles that were about him and about his life, and I paid attention to the way he told his particular story, the story of his life. And from that, I think I learned that, different people had different perspectives on the subject. The biographers of, say, Theodore Dreiser would have one view about his feud with Sinclair Lewis, and Sinclair Lewis partisans and biographers would have a different view about their rivalry. There's a story about Dreiser slapping Sinclair Lewis, the slap heard round the world, it was called. And they had different stories. People, depending upon who wrote the book, they had different perspectives. Who was at fault? And that was a valuable lesson to me, because I realized history and biography, those kinds of things are not one set story that is true to everybody, is that different people have different perspectives. And so I did this was sort of the sort of way I spent a good part of my time as a teenager, and in addition to being in the band and the debate society and all those kinds of things, that was my sort of fun. The thing that I love to do is to read novels and then find out whatever I could about the person who wrote them. And that continued, through college and through my time here. When I moved to New York City, the New York Public Library was a destination for me on Saturdays. I was practicing law as an associate. I probably should have been doing that. But I was drawn to this place because I could continue in this odd kind of habit that I had, is sort of thinking about people's lives and thinking about controversies. I could do a book about literary feuds, I think, if I actually put my mind to it, because I loved seeing the conflict and seeing how they were resolved in these pages. Fast forward, 1994, there was a movie to be made about Jefferson called Jefferson in Paris. And even before the movie was made, maybe, even certainly before it was finished and before it came out, there were lots of comments by historians and other commenters who said, because the movie was going to treat the story of Jefferson and Sally Hemings, that Jefferson had a long-term connection to Sally Hemings and had children with her, an enslaved woman on his plantation. A number of people said that's absolutely not true. There's no evidence for that. But because of my sort of eccentric interest in Jefferson over the years and this pattern that I had of reading biographies of him and other people, I understood that there was evidence. It may not have been proof, but there was evidence. In Fawn Brody's book, Biography, there were two recollections at the back of the book, one by a man named Madison Hemings, who claimed to be the son of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and one by a man named Israel Jefferson. His real name is Israel Gillette, we know now, but he was given the name Jefferson. And they say that this is true, and they talk about it. There was not proof that this story was true, but it was evidence. And I found myself really offended by the idea that enslaved people could talk about something that happened in their lives, something that was common. In every slave society that's ever existed, there have been children, offspring of the male enslavers and female domestics, female workers. And so it shouldn't have been treated as though it was something weird, but it was because of who Jefferson was. And so I went to the New York Public Library, and I sat in the Rose Reading Room, and I was going to write an op-ed. And I started writing the op-ed, and it got longer and longer. And finally, I said, you have this, again, eccentric interest in this place. I taught myself, I think, to research by what I was doing as a teenager. Right? Not knowing that this is what, I was doing, but every single thing that I had been doing from the time, I was, 12 to the time I started working on this book, prepared me to do what I had to do for that book. And it prepared me to look at people's lives, to know the difference. That's a different story when you're looking at, trying to tease out something that people are trying to hide versus something that they want to tell you or that they don't mind telling you. And what historians had been doing, biographers of Jefferson had been doing, was saying, well, look at the letters. There's no Sally Hemings. He's not admitting that he's having children with these enslaved women in these letters. Well, of course he's not, because that's not the legacy that he wanted. That's not how he wanted to be remembered. He understood that that would ruin his legacy if people believe that because of attitudes, his own attitudes, but his community's attitudes about those interracial connections, leaving aside the question of consent and all of those things that are problems for us today. During their time, the question was about race mixing, and he understood that that would be a problem. So my first book is not really a biography, but it didn't set out to be a biography. It's about historians, about Jefferson's, more than historians, Jefferson biographers, and a critique of Jefferson biographers and how they had written the story of his life by ignoring evidence from people for whom they had no respect or who didn't count, in favor of crafting a life based upon the person's own words and the words of other people who were trying to protect him, namely his family. And saying, treating the family story in these biographies as if something akin to land ownership. It's like they owned Jefferson in the way that a family might own a plot of land. And we listen to them because they have the legal right to tell the official story, the biography of this individual. And that had to be, I thought that had to be broken apart. People involved in the system of slavery, where you had one group of people exercising an enormous amount of power over individuals beyond anything that we can imagine now, shouldn't be treated as if this was just a normal circumstance and that these people did not have things to hide, because they did have things to hide. And so my first book came out, and I thought I wanted to try, because this is a subject, Jefferson is a subject, as you can tell, that I've been interested in a long time. I wanted to change the way people would be writing his biography. I wanted the Hemings family to figure into the story in a way that they had not up until this point, and to make the point that you can't really understand Jefferson as a person without understanding the institution of slavery and how that shaped his life. And people were writing about him basically from the position that the only important thing, or the main important thing about him, was that he's the principal author of the American Declaration of Independence, that he was the president, the founder of the University of Virginia. I could go on and on and on. All of those things are true, but if you want to write about the individual and understand the individual, you have to understand the fact that he lived up on a mountain at various points in time with upwards of 200 or 250 African-American people, with nothing but maybe his daughters at some time and a few white working men. And he interacted with those people on a daily basis. And he talked about them. He had them, he worked with them as woodworking. He supervised their activities. And he had children with one of them. And his wife's father had children with had six children with an enslaved woman, one of whom was Sally Hemings. So Sally Hemings was his wife's half-sister. You can't tell a story of a person, you can't think about what that life was like without using that material, thinking about that material. And historians and biographers, and I'm putting these two together here, basically shunted that to the side. And I think a lot of the reluctance was not just about not believing it, but if you think about how that complicates the story of his life, and what kind of person he was, what was his life like? Did he struggle over this? Was this a problem? Did this make him unhappy? Unfortunately, all of those kinds of things will have to be left to fiction to answer those questions, but raising them, pointing these things out, changes things. When I'm writing, I could say, so the first book comes out, the next year, DNA corroborates what I said in the first book and changed many people's attitudes about Jefferson, and so now there's a different way of writing about Jefferson. But I thought that's not really enough to do. I mean, this is a person who, there's lots and lots of information about him. He manages to keep records of almost everything. He has a memorandum book. He puts down all of the transactions that he ever engaged in, monetary transactions from the time he's in his 20s until his 80s. It's the 2-volume, over 1,000 pages. I went today and spent $3.60 on a Starbucks coffee. Write it down. That's the kind of thing. This very compulsive thing that he did. So you know a lot about him. He's in over almost 20,000 letters. He's a person who gives a lot of information without being particularly informative. There's no diary. John Quincy Adams, John Adams, they have diaries and they crack on themselves and make jokes and are he doesn't do that. He says his letters are his diary, his biography in a way, but those are very crafted, things that he worked on very, very hard and arranged them in the way that he wanted people to read them, and was very orderly about that. But there's a lot to work with, but he is still to people very, very mysterious. So after my first book came out, after the DNA came out, and we understood that there's this whole new element, adding a woman and 7 children, 4 who lived to adulthood, to a person's life is a big deal. I mean, what's up with that? I mean, he's got grandchildren who are living at Monticello at some point after their father fails, and Jefferson's daughter brings her 12 children to live at Monticello. And there's this, what we call a shadow family, with an enslaved woman who are the same age as his grandchildren, and they're running around together. So you can't do that without rethinking the story of life at Monticello. And so what I wanted to do with the Hemmingses of Monticello was to try to write a biography, and the title of this talk is, writing the lives of people who are known and unknown. Jefferson obviously would be the known person, and we have a lot to work with. And the Hemmingses are more or less unknown, and I think one of the reasons it was easy to dismiss them as a subject or not listen to their story is because people did not know who they were. They were thought of as an enslaved man, an enslaved, woman or whatever. When Malone and others talk about Jefferson going to Paris with James Hemings, which is one of Sally Hemings's brothers, or when he's talking about them coming back, he refers to them as, or Robert Hemings, they're referred to as Jefferson's servants. But if you refer to Robert Hemings or James Hemings as actually his wife's half-brother, enslaved half-brother, it changes the way you think about these people, because they knew this. And even if we don't know how they felt about each other, you have to understand that that's not a totally arm's length. It was not a totally arm's length connection. His treatment of them shows that connection made a difference to him. So just little things like that, the difference between writing servant and writing enslaved half-brother, enslaved servant, or enslaved person, changes the way people think about it, and that's what I wanted to do with the Hemings family. I didn't have enough information to write a biography of any one of them. There can't be a real effective biography of Sally Hemings, a book. You could do something in an article, and I've written articles that come close to something like that, but if I did the Hemings family of Monticello and get them all in there was enough information to craft a picture of this family from the few fragments of things that you could get from Jefferson's memorandum book that I mentioned before, from his letters. Some members of the Hemings family were literate, so we have their letters, and you can sort of glean what they were like from, from the letters of John Hemings, if people have been to Monticello. Some of the woodworking there still survives as work of John Hemings, who was Sally Hemings' half-brother. Those kinds of things, taking Jefferson's records, what I knew from the Hemings family, from their writings and letters, from oral history, family history from the Hemings family. I mean, oral history can be problematic. Family history can be problematic because it's like a game of telephone. So you tell a story over here, and by the time you're whispering it, by the time it gets over here, it's something completely different. Same thing with stories. A great aunt after generations can become a great grandmother. And people aren't doing it on purpose. It's a mix-up because it's not written down. And oral history is very, very valuable, but it has that weakness. And what you can do with that, and fortunately we could do it because of Jefferson's records, is to corroborate the oral history. There are documents, there are ways to show that this person is credible and show things that happened that jibe with what this individual said in her family history. So I had those three things to work with. And I started from the proposition that I would take them seriously. If you see the Hemings story, for example, as a problem, if you start out seeing it as a scandal, as a problem, it will affect the way you do the research, the way you look at these things. If you look at it and say, this kind of thing happened in the South, in slave societies, all over, then, and it's not a problem in the sense, something that you have to save Jefferson from, you can achieve a level, I think I could achieve a level of objectivity that was helpful. You'll never be totally objective about this, about any of these things. You can't do it, but you can try for it, to try to look at things as clearly as possible and to gather as much information as you can about it. And one of the things that was very important to me, and I think I hope to achieve with the Hemmingses of Monticello, was to show, not just talk about them. One of my co-author, Peter Onoff, with whom I've written another book about Jefferson, a biography of Jefferson, says that the Hemmingses of Monticello is actually also a biography of Jefferson, because you learn a lot about him through them. And this goes back to what I was saying before. We are who we are, but we are who we are in relationship to other people. And he had relationships with not just Sally Hemings, and I don't mean relationships in the terms of sex. I mean, they make no sense without the web of connections to her mother, to her brothers, to her uncles, all of those people. They were part of a network of connections that mattered to the Hemmingses and mattered to Jefferson as well. And one of the hardest things to do, and for me, was to try to stand outside of my own feelings about this. I construct Jefferson, say, as an enemy of the Hemings family, the enemy of Sally Hemings. And when I was writing my first book, a question that I was asked all the time about her life, was why on earth would she come back from France, where she had a chance for freedom, to live with Thomas Jefferson? And people asked me that, and I didn't have a satisfactory answer for that when I was working on my first book, when I was focusing in on the argument about what biographers had done. I was really looking at them, and the book was about them. The Hemmingses are part of the story, but it was more about their writing. When I was writing the Hemings family story, I had to think about them in the way that I wanted everybody else to think about them, as individuals, in the context of their time, and looking at the things that they knew about the society around them, the world around them, and to try to recreate that as best as I could. And it wasn't until I'd gotten through the book and had done the book that I understood better, still don't, understood better why she felt that that was the best thing to do. I understood what her family meant to her, because I had spent time going through all of the letters and learning of the things that had happened in the family and how they had responded to it. I understood that her brothers were given freedoms that other enslaved men did not have. Lots of times Jefferson didn't know where they were. They went off and hired themselves out and kept the money, which was against the law. They were not supposed to do that, but he let them do that. The women didn't go to the fields. The Hemings women were the only people who didn't have to pitch in and go to the fields at harvest time. They were treated like farmers' wives. Essentially, they did things that you would expect, a domestic white woman to do: sewing, cooking, looking after children. That's what they did. The distinction that had been made between black women and white women from the beginning of slavery is that only black women went to the fields, were fit to go to the fields. White women didn't. Now, that's not true. White women did, in fact, go to the fields. But, people very often judge society by what middle class to upper middle class people are doing. That's the standard. But of course, poorer white women went to the fields. But the Hemings women didn't go to the fields. And I'm thinking of a teenage girl who saw that happen, saw her family treated in that way, how she might view him in the context of that time. I see him as enemy, and she may well has too, but enemy nevertheless, who has created a different life for my family. And I might be able to make it out of this in a way where I could get my children free out of the institution of slavery and end that in my line. I mean, just think of what it would be like to be a woman and to know that slavery, the institution of slavery, came through you. When the English colonists came to America, the rule was you were what your father was. And they switched that to decide, in Virginia at least, and then eventually everybody adopts this partus sequitur ventrum. You are what your mother is. And you could think about what difference that makes for slavery if it had continued to go through the male line. Men could have many, many more children than women. The sexuality of women was much more controlled than that of males. Otherwise, you would have a large class of mixed race free people creating all kinds of problems. So by coming back with him, the story, if people haven't heard it, the story is that she and her brother James had a chance for freedom in France, and she nevertheless decides to come back with Jefferson after he promises her that she would have a good life at Monticello, and all of her children, any children they had, would be freed when they were 21. And, you know, again, people asked me when I wrote the first book, why would she go for that? Aside from the fact of being a teenager and not, you know, the teenager. Now, I don't think the category of teenager really did not exist in the 18th century in the way we think of it. I think of, you know, a 16 or 17-year-old as a child. They would not have been thought of, she would not have been thought of as a child during that time period. The age of consent in Virginia during this time period was 10. They raised it to 12 in the 1820s, and it stayed that way up until the 20th. I mean, you know, the 20th century is when you really get the sort of increase in the age of consent and understanding of when a person becomes an adult. So from doing this book, doing the Hemingses of Monticello, expanded my understanding of this family, what this family was about, what it meant to Jefferson, and Jefferson's own, you know, sense of himself, of who Jefferson was. And so by the time I finished this book, I had a different view of this person whom I had studied and had been studying since I was, you know, in the 3rd grade. It broadened my sense of how to do a biography of him. I'm supposed to be doing a 2-volume biography of Jefferson. Now, after on Juneteenth, I'm not so sure. Texas may beckon me for that, to do that, but it certainly helped me when I did the book Most Blessed of the Patriarchs with Peter Onuf, where I look at Jefferson, not a sort of a straight-through biography, but taking all that I had learned from all the years I've been studying him and what I learned from doing the Hemingses of Monticello to try to figure out who this person was, really. Not just the political side of him, but it's more Jefferson at home. Jefferson and his sense of himself. One of the things that has happened over the years is that Jefferson has always been a controversial figure, but biographies have moved much more towards specialized looks at him. Jefferson and this, Jefferson and slavery, Jefferson and politics. Most Blessed of the Patriarchs tries to bring him back together and start from the proposition, thinking about what he thought of himself. And that doesn't happen so much with Jefferson biographies now. More people are interested in saying what they feel about him. I mean, because there is a genre, I mean, there's a genre of loving the subject too much, but there's also the genre of sort of a hate biography. where people, and I don't understand that one. I mean, writing about someone that you hate, and maybe there's probably a charge out of that you get from, that people get from doing that. But I wanted, both Peter and I wanted to move away from that and to take him as much as we can at his word, to try to remember what it was about this person that made him such a figure of interest over time, aside from the fact that he had his hand in almost everything that you could think of in the early American Republic. I don't think there's anyone, I mean, Franklin comes close to him, but Franklin dies before the 1790s. He's not a part of the battle, the crucible of the creation of the early American Republic in that way. And Jefferson lives a long time he's an American. He ends up being an American for most of his life as opposed to, a Brit. And, there's the presidency, Secretary of State, the grid that the country's laid out on, the Jefferson grid, the, Library of Congress, West Point, all kinds of things you could point to that he's a part of. And we wanted to try to use what we both knew. Peter is an intellectual historian, and he writes about Jefferson's political thought. And to have the two of us together to write a biography, and he doesn't like the title biographer. He likes the title historian, and he is historian, but he's a biographer as well. An interesting experiment to have a political and social historian and a biographer and an intellectual historian to put our heads together to come up with a biography that tries to integrate this subject and integrate this person into, make him whole. And that's what Most Blessed of the Patriarchs is about. And it's interesting because, it's like I've never left, in some ways, the third grade, thinking about this person because he exemplifies so much of the American story. I mean, I say in the Hemingses of Monticello that Monticello is where we've been, the best of where we've been and the worst, all in this one place, and all in this individual, and which is why it's hard to think of sort of moving him off the stage without doing damage to ourselves, to our understanding of who we are. The flawed beginning, the idealism that's a part of the American character, trying to work through these flaws. And so he remains an evergreen topic for me. The Hemingses remain an evergreen topic for me because it shows America in a way that I think when people go up to the mountain or when they read biographies of Jefferson, you can sort of understand who we are. And maybe that's what I was looking for, too, as a kid, trying to scope out what it was like, how we got to a point where I lived in a society where when I went to the doctor, there was a separate waiting room for whites and blacks. When we went to the movies, we had to sit in the balcony. And my father, who had been a Korean War veteran, when he came home to that society. And I integrated our town school, the schools in our town, and I wanted to figure out what this was all about. And writing about this person's life, understanding this person's life at the beginnings of our society was a way for me to do that. And I've been eternally grateful that I ran into that biography so long ago because it's put me on the path to where I am today. So thank you.
Thank you, Annette. That was wonderful, revealing, and we're all looking forward to the next 2 volumes or the next book.